The morning Sylvie Caron walked into the Pemberton General break room and found her locker emptied onto the floor, she didn't cry. She hadn't cried in a long time. She crouched down, gathered her stethoscope, her granola bars, her spare pair of compression socks, and placed them back on the shelf, one by one, with the same quiet efficiency she used to reset a crash cart. Nobody in the room said anything. 3 nurses stood by the coffee machine, and not one of them looked at her. That was the thing about being a travel nurse. You came in as a stranger, and in most places you left as one too. Pemberton was a small city about 2 hours north of Vancouver. The kind of place where everyone's cousin worked in the same school board, where the Tim Hortons on Cedar Street had regulars who'd been coming in every morning for 30 years. Pemberton General wasn't large, but it had the particular culture of small hospitals, tight-knit, tradition-bound, and deeply suspicious of outsiders. Sylvie had taken the 4-month contract because the money was good and because she needed the distance. She hadn't counted on Fiona Levine. Fiona was the charge nurse on 4 North, internal medicine, and she had the specific confidence of someone who had never once been challenged. She was competent, Sylvie would give her that. She'd been at Pemberton General for 11 years, and she knew its rhythms the way you know a house you grew up in, every creak, every draft, every shortcut. What she did not have was patience for anyone who didn't defer to her immediately, and Sylvie Caron, who had worked pediatric ICUs in Toronto and trauma wards in Halifax, was not someone who deferred reflexively to anyone. The first week, it had been small things. Sylvie's patient assignments loaded late on the board. Her supply requests sat unprocessed. When she raised a concern in handoff about a post-op patient whose urine output had been dropping since 0300, Fiona had talked over her, finished the handoff, and then told the oncoming nurse to keep an eye on it. The patient had gone into acute kidney injury by noon. Sylvie had documented everything. Fiona had not spoken directly to her for 5 days after that. The second week, it escalated. A colleague named Barb, sweet, nervous, 2 years out of school, stopped sitting with Sylvie at lunch. Then Thierry, the young unit clerk who'd been friendly and funny in Sylvie's first days, started avoiding eye contact in the hallway. By the 3rd week, Sylvie understood that Fiona had been working, steadily and quietly, the way competent bullies always do, saying things in the right ears, framing Sylvie's competence as arrogance, framing her documentation habit as tattling, framing her questions as aggression. Sylvie told herself she'd outlast it. She had 4 months. She could keep her head down. But then came the morning of the pharmacy dispute. A physician had written an order that Sylvie flagged as potentially contraindicated given the patient's documented sulfa allergy. Not a dramatic catch, just due diligence, the kind of thing any careful nurse does as a matter of routine. She had called the prescribing resident, who thanked her and amended the order. Standard, clean, done. Fiona had been standing near the nursing station when it happened. She'd waited until the resident left and then turned to Sylvie in front of 4 people, 2 nurses, a physiotherapist, and a unit aide, and said, in a tone that was calm the way a blade is calm, "You do realize, Dr. Marchand has been practicing for 12 years. Maybe let the physicians do their job." Sylvie had kept her voice even. The order conflicted with a documented allergy. I followed protocol. Protocol. Fiona smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't involve the eyes. Right, she walked away. The 2 nurses at the station looked down at their computers. The physiotherapist suddenly needed to be somewhere else. Only the unit aide, a teenager named Frederick who'd been there 6 weeks himself, met Sylvie's eyes. And the look on his face was the particular misery of someone watching something unfair happen and knowing there is nothing they can do about it. Sylvie went into the medication room, closed the door, stood with her back against the shelf of IV bags and breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth. 4 counts in, 6 counts out. She had learned this in a PICU on a night when a 7-year-old didn't make it, and she used it now the same way she'd used it then. Not to stop feeling things, but to make sure feelings didn't stop her from functioning. She had 3 months and 11 days left on her contract. What Fiona Levine did not know, what none of them knew, was that Sylvie Caron had a brother. His name was Marc-André Caron, and he was 34 years old, and he had spent the last 11 years in Joint Task Force 2. Canada's Tier 1 Special Operations Unit, the one that doesn't give press conferences, the one whose operators don't typically discuss what they do at family dinners. He was quiet, the way deep water is quiet. He had the kind of stillness that comes from spending a long time in situations where noise gets people killed. When he smiled, which he did more than people expected, it changed his whole face. But you had to be paying attention to catch it. He had a dog named Boone. Boone was a Belgian Malinois, 5 years old, retired from operational service 18 months ago after a deployment overseas that Marc-André didn't describe in detail. Boone had come home with Marc-André because the alternative wasn't something Marc-André had been willing to consider. The dog had a scar along his left flank, a slight hitch in his right hind leg in cold weather, and an intelligence in his eyes that people who didn't know dogs sometimes found unnerving. He read rooms, he read people. He knew without being told when something was wrong. Marc-André had driven up from Vancouver that weekend because Sylvie hadn't sounded like herself on the phone. She hadn't said anything was wrong. She was good at not saying things were wrong, had been their whole lives the older sibling who handled things, who didn't ask for help, who reframed every difficulty as manageable. But he'd been reading her voice since he was old enough to notice that her voice had registers, and something in it that Thursday night had made him get into his truck on Saturday morning with Boone in the back seat. He didn't tell her he was coming. He knew she'd tell him not to. He arrived at the hospital just before the end of her shift. He hadn't planned it that way. He'd stopped twice, once for gas and once to let Boone stretch. But the timing put him in the Pemberton General parking lot at 1845, which was when day shift ended on 4 North. He sat in the truck, Boone's head on his shoulder from the back seat, and watched the front entrance. He wasn't worried about anything specific. He just wanted to see her. He saw her come through the sliding doors at 1853. She was in her scrubs, her bag over one shoulder, her hair still up in the practical bun she'd worn since nursing school. She looked fine at a distance. She looked the way she always looked, capable, contained. But she walked with her eyes down, and her shoulders were carrying something, and Marc-André, who had spent his career learning to read body language across distances in conditions far worse than a hospital parking lot, knew immediately that whatever was happening up there on 4 North was not small. He got out of the truck. Boone came with him, leashed, trotting at his left knee in the unhurried, exact way he moved everywhere. Sylvie had almost reached the far end of the parking lot, not looking up, before she heard his voice say her name. She stopped, turned, stood very still for a moment in the way people do when they are trying to recalibrate what they're seeing. Mark. Her voice came out differently than she intended. Hey. He crossed the distance between them. Boone sat when they stopped, pressed lightly against Marc-André's leg, watching Sylvie with the steady attention he gave to people he'd decided were important. She said, "You didn't tell me you were coming." "I know. I would have. I know." She looked at him. He looked at her. Then she looked down at Boone and crouched down and put both hands on the dog's big square head, and Boone pushed into it gently, and she didn't say anything for a long time. They went to the diner across from the hospital, the kind that's been there forever, with laminated menus and booth seats that have been repaired with electrical tape. Marc-André got a coffee and a piece of lemon meringue pie. Sylvie got tea she didn't drink. Boone settled under the table, his chin on Marc-André's boot. She told him about it slowly, the way you tell someone something when you haven't quite let yourself look at it directly yet. The locker, the handoff, the pharmacy incident, Barb not sitting with her anymore, Thierry's avoidance. She was careful and factual about it, the way she was careful and factual about everything, and that was the thing that struck him most, that she was describing a sustained campaign of workplace harassment with the same measured affect she might use to describe a difficult patient presentation, because she'd decided it was manageable, because she'd decided she didn't need help. He listened without interrupting, which was something people who didn't know him well sometimes found unnerving too, the capacity to receive information without immediately generating a response. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How much longer on the contract?" 11 weeks. You could break it. I don't break contracts." He looked at her. She looked back. "I know," he said. "I know you don't." He had a second coffee. The diner filled and emptied around them. At some point, the owner, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses pushed up on her head, brought Boone a bowl of water without being asked. Boone stood up, drank half of it with great seriousness, and lay back down. Marc-André had intended to stay the night. He had a friend in Pemberton he could stay with, an old colleague from his army days, now working as a contractor, and head back Sunday. He revised this plan quietly while Sylvie wasn't looking. He stayed the week. He didn't come to the hospital, didn't show up at Sylvie's apartment during her shifts, didn't make any of the gestures that would have embarrassed her or made her feel managed. He was just there, in Pemberton, doing what he did in any location, waking early, running with Boone in the gray morning light along the river trail, taking up space in a quiet way that some people found grounding just by proximity. On Wednesday, Sylvie had a day off. They drove out to the lake. Boone waded in up to his chest and stood there, looking at the mountains across the water with an expression of absolute satisfaction. Sylvie sat on a rock and laughed. Really laughed. The kind that comes unexpectedly and sounds a little ragged, like something dislodged. Marc-Andre skipped a stone and didn't say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. That night she told him the fuller version, that it hadn't started with Fiona, that her last contract, in a hospital in northern Alberta, had been fine, collegial even, except for one physician who didn't like being questioned by a nurse, and that one before that had been good, genuinely good, and that she sometimes wondered if she carried something with her, some quality that attracted this, that made it happen. She said it lightly, almost as a footnote. Marc-Andre looked at her for a long time. "You're describing people who can't handle competence," he said finally. "That's their problem. That's been their problem every time." She didn't answer. "You document everything." "I do." "Then you're fine. You're doing it right." It wasn't absolution, exactly. It wasn't meant to be. It was the specific thing she needed, not comfort but corroboration, confirmation that her read of the situation was accurate and that she wasn't the source of the problem. She was a nurse who'd been nursing for 8 years, and she understood clinical reality, and she was not imagining this. She nodded once and looked back at the water. The following Friday was when it happened. Sylvie was coming off a long shift, 12 hours on a day that had included 2 difficult discharges, a family meeting that ran an hour over, and a patient in room 412 who had been angry and frightened and had taken it out on the nearest person, which was Sylvie. She was tired in the particular way of a shift that was hard not because of medical emergencies, but because of the weight of sustained human need. She was crossing the main lobby toward the exit when she heard Fiona's voice. Fiona was standing near the information desk with 2 nurses from another unit, people Sylvie didn't know, and a woman in administrative clothing who might have been a manager of some kind. They were talking, and then Fiona said clearly, without lowering her voice, "The problem with travel nurses is that they come in thinking they know better than everyone, and they don't realize how disruptive that is. Some people just shouldn't be in a team environment." She didn't say Sylvie's name. She didn't have to. Sylvie had just passed through the lobby door. 2 of the women glanced over. Sylvie stopped walking. The lobby was not empty. There was a volunteer at the gift shop, a family near the elevator, a porter with a wheelchair. She stood with her bag on her shoulder and felt something clarify, the way things sometimes clarify after a long time of being murky. A specific and exhausted anger, clean-edged, quiet. She turned around. She walked back, not fast, not aggressive, just with direction, and stood far enough away to be appropriate, but close enough to be unmistakable. "I'm going to assume that was about me," she said, "since I'm the only travel nurse on this unit." She kept her voice level. "I want to be clear. I follow protocol, I document carefully, and I advocate for my patients. If that's disruptive, that's a conversation worth having with administration." Fiona's face did the thing it did. Calm, dismissive, slightly amused. "I wasn't referring to anyone in particular. Then there's no issue." Sylvie looked at the woman in the administrative clothing. "Are you in hospital administration?" A pause. The woman said yes. She was assistant director of patient care services. "I'd like to schedule a meeting," Sylvie said. "I have documentation I'd like to share." She left before Fiona could respond. Her hands were shaking in the elevator. Not badly, but they were shaking. She stood with her back against the elevator wall and breathed, 4 counts in, 6 counts out, and thought, that's done, and now it's in motion, and whatever comes next, she had done it right. Marc-Andre was outside. He had Boone on a long leash, and they were sitting on the low concrete wall near the main entrance, just sitting, not waiting in any obvious way, not loitering. Just a man and his dog enjoying the early evening air with the particular self-possession of someone who has done a lot of waiting in a lot of places and developed a relationship with time that most people don't have. Sylvie came through the doors and stopped. He looked up. "You're still here," she said. He was supposed to have driven back to Vancouver that morning. "Changed my mind." He looked at her face. "What happened?" she told him. They walked to the truck while she talked, Boone matching her pace on her left side in a way that was somehow companionable without being intrusive, that quality he had of being present without pressing. Marc-Andre listened to the whole thing before he responded. "You asked for the meeting." "Yes." "Good." He opened the passenger door for her and then helped Boone into the back. "That's exactly right." She got in. He got in. Boone settled with a sigh that sounded like a small editorial on the whole situation. "I was terrified," she said quietly, when they were pulling out of the lot. "I know. It didn't feel like it looked from the outside. It never does." He glanced at her. "You still did it." They drove to the diner because neither of them particularly wanted to cook, and they sat in the same booth with the electrical tape repair on the seat, and Boone settled under the table again, and the owner brought his water bowl without being asked. They ordered dinner this time. Sylvie ate everything on her plate, which Marc-Andre noted without comment. The meeting with the assistant director happened the following Tuesday. Sylvie brought her documentation. 11 weeks of it, dates, times, specifics, the pharmacy incident, the handoff incident, the escalating social exclusion, every significant event logged with the same clinical precision she brought to patient care. She had not known when she started doing it that she would ever need to use it. She did it because documentation was what you did. You recorded what happened, accurately and completely, because reality had a way of becoming contested, and you needed a record. The assistant director, her name was Lemaire, and she was a person who listened in a way that felt like genuine attention, not performance. Went through the documentation in silence. Then she asked several questions. Then she thanked Sylvie for coming in. Sylvie didn't know what would happen next and said so. "I can't tell you the specifics of what we'll do internally," Lemaire said, "but I can tell you that what you've brought forward is significant and will be taken seriously." Sylvie nodded. "How are you doing?" Lemaire asked. Honestly, it was an unexpected question. Sylvie thought about it rather than answering automatically. "Better," she said, "since this week. Better than I was." She had one more shift that week. She went in on Thursday morning with the specific quality of calm that comes after a threshold has been crossed. Not resolution yet, not certainty, but the knowledge that she had done what she could do and that the rest was not in her hands. Fiona was not on shift that day. Someone said she was attending a mandatory meeting with HR. Barb found Sylvie at the medication cart mid-morning. She stood there for a moment, awkward, and then said, "I should have sat with you at lunch. I'm sorry I didn't." Sylvie looked at her. Barb was 24, 2 years out of school, had presumably spent those 2 years developing a sense of how things worked on this unit and what happened to people who went against the current. "It's okay," Sylvie said, and meant it, mostly. "She said things about you. I should have." Barb stopped. "I should have known better. You were in a hard position. You were in a harder one." Sylvie thought about that. "Yes," she said, "I was." That evening, Marc-Andre finally drove back to Vancouver. Sylvie walked him out to the parking lot of her building, Boone circling them both in a final inspection before loading himself into the back seat. She stood with her arms crossed against the October chill and watched as her brother secure Boone's travel harness with the same methodical care he brought to everything. "You didn't have to stay the whole week," she said. "I know. I had it handled." "You did." He closed the truck door and turned to look at her. "I know you did." She rolled her eyes very slightly, in a way she'd been doing since she was 9 years old, and he was 7 and already annoying. "Then why did you stay?" He shrugged. Not evasively, he wasn't an evasive person, but with the particular economy of someone who doesn't spend words on things that are already understood between people who have known each other their whole lives. "Because I wanted to," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. Boone made a sound from the back seat that might have been impatience. "Drive safe," she said. "Always." She watched the truck until it turned out of the lot. The mountains were dark shapes against a darker sky, and the air smelled like river water and pine and the particular clean coldness that settles over British Columbia in the fall. She stood there a moment longer than she needed to. She finished her contract, 11 weeks, every shift. She documented, she advocated, she followed protocol, she asked her questions without apology. Fiona remained on the unit and remained Fiona. There were things Sylvie could not change and had made peace with not changing. But something had shifted. The social temperature was different, not warm exactly, but no longer hostile. Frederick, the teenage unit aide, started bringing her coffee from the machine without being asked. Dr. Marchand, the physician whose order she'd flagged that first month, stopped her in the hall one afternoon and told her he'd seen her chart notes and that her documentation practice was the clearest he'd encountered in years. "I appreciate that," she said, and she did. She gave notice on her last shift, signed the paperwork, returned her badge. Lemaire caught her in the hallway on her way out and shook her hand with something that felt like sincerity. "Where next?" Lemaire asked. "Halifax," Sylvie said. "Pediatrics." Lemaire smiled. "They're lucky to have you." She called Marc-Andre from the highway, heading east, the mountains in her rearview mirror catching the last of the afternoon light. "It's done," she said. "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly, the way she'd learned to answer that question. "Okay," she said. "Actually okay." Boone made a sound in the background. He was apparently in the room or the truck or wherever Marc-Andre was, and she laughed, that same dislodged laugh from the day at the lake. "Give him my best," she said. "He says good luck." She drove into the evening. The road opened out ahead of her, long and straight, the kind of road that makes you feel like you're moving towards something rather than away from it. She turned the radio on. She let herself feel, without qualification, the specific lightness of having done the right thing in a situation where doing the right thing had cost her something, and having come through it still recognizably herself, her values intact, her documentation precise, her voice still willing to speak when speaking was what was needed. Whatever came next, she would be ready. She had always been ready. She was a nurse, and she had a brother, and she had learned a long time ago that those two facts together were more than enough.